Hi everyone. This video is going to cover more advanced CSS styling. As such, this video is not required if you want to learn the basics of CSS. This is really going to give you fancy styling that will add polish to your site, but is not necessary in the vast majority of cases. First thing we'll be covering is an alternative color mode called hue saturation lightness, or HSL. And HSL operates much like RGB. You specify HSL, and then in parentheses you specify the values. Unlike RGB though, there are not separate color channels. Instead, the first number, which is going to be your hue, will specify the base color. And this is a number from 0 up to 360 for red. So red is actually 0 and 360, and the other colors are the remainder of the colors on the color wheel. The next number is saturation. 100% is going to specify full saturation of the color, meaning that there's no additional gray added to the color. 50% lightness is going to specify the base kind of normal lightness on that color, and 100% is going to specify a white tint of that. So if we see 80%, that's like a pink, and then shades are under 50%. So like 20% is a very, very dark red here. So let's take an example here. Let's say that you want, say, a greenish color. We can start with, here's kind of a base green, and we could say, I want to do kind of a pastel green. Let's do 85%, and then let's actually reduce the saturation down a little bit to 75%. And you see we end up with this nice kind of mint pastel green. And HSL is really nice as a color mode because it allows you to do more common sense adjustments to your values in order to get the color fine-tuned to exactly what you're looking for. You can also do linear and radial gradients with the linear and radial gradient values. So these are actually specified via the background property because these are treated as background images instead of background colors. So you'll use the shorthand background property and then either linear or radial gradient. We're going to start with linear so that you can see how these work. And you need to specify multiple colors in order for your gradient to work. So we're going to start with a simple red to yellow, which you see transitions from red through orange and into yellow here. You can also specify the direction that the gradient works as well as where it starts from. So for instance, if I specify to right, it's going to do my gradient from the left side, red, over to the right, yellow. I can also specify percentages for where these stops are, and that will allow you to set your gradient stops at very particular locations. The natural one is going to be 0 to 100. If you just specify two values, you can do a 0 to 100, but you can also specify specific stop locations. You can also add in additional stops here. And naturally, this will space these out, but again, you can set different values on them to adjust where those stops are. Radial gradients work similarly to linear ones, but they are a little bit different here in that you need to specify the shape of the gradient because you can have circle gradients as well as elliptical gradients. So there's several different options for those. You can also specify where they start, the position of them, the stops. You can have multiple stops, so you can transition across multiple different colors. But the main difference here is instead of directionality, your biggest thing to deal with is shape. Again, you can also do directionality, which is mostly done with angles. So you can do 45 degrees, 90 degrees, and so on. And these are actually specified via the DEG attribute uh, for your value. Next up is text shadows, and these are basically the same as box shadows, just applied to individual text boxes. So let's take our H1 here, and we are going to apply a text shadow, and this is done via the text shadow property here. And just like box shadows, these have an X offset, which is your first value, a Y offset, a blur, and a color. You can also set multiple backgrounds in CSS3 with the background shorthand property. And these are separated with commas, and the first value in the stack is going to be the highest background that displays on top of all the other ones. And then they go progressively lower in the stack as you go further on. So let's say, for instance, that we have a background image and we want to lay a linear gradient on top of it. We would put the linear gradient value before that background image. And let's say we want this to go to the right, and we're going to do an RGB alpha so that we go from 10% black to 40% black. And you see we end up with this lighter background over here and a darker background over here, but we still have our background image, which provides the texture for this. This can be a really useful way to do things like change the color of a background pattern, or to lay multiple background images with transparency on top of each other, or to lay a background color with a transparent gradient, and do some really interesting kinds of effects. The rest of this video is going to cover the really fancy stuff in the form of transitions, filters, transforms, and animations. So transitions in CSS are a way to take an object and move it from one state to another state gradually over time. And this is primarily used on hover effects, so mouse over effects on things like hyperlinks. So let's take our H1, and I'm going to specify a hover effect on our H1. And I'm going to say, let's give this a background color of red so you can see it. And I'm also going to give it a width of 50%. From there, I'm going to say on hover, we're going to give it full width. And you'll see that when we hover, it moves over to be full width. However, that's a very clunky kind of move. So we're going to instead add a transition in here. And transitions are done with the transition shorthand property. And you need to specify what is transitioning, in this case, width, as well as how long the transition will take. We're going to do 1s for 1 second, but you can also do things like 0.5s for half a second, or identically 500 ms for 500 milliseconds, meaning half a second. And finally, we're going to provide how the transition is going to occur. And The most common one you see is ease in out because this provides a nice smooth transition. There are other options for you though, and that's something that you can look at various documentation for. So let's take a look, and you see we have the transition on width. Width is not a very common one, so much more common would be things like background color, which we're going to change the background color over to blue on this. You'll see that nothing happens with the transition yet because we have the width property set. So we could change over to background color here, and that'll do it, but we can also change this over to all, which is going to change all of our properties, so that if we had our width decreasing in size, that we would have both the color and the width changing. Another really nice thing to do here is to add the transition property to the initial state. And this is a little counterintuitive. But if you add the transition property to the initial state, then when you leave the hover, it also the transition occurs backwards as well. So this is a way to ensure that it transitions both in and out of your hover state. Another really nice feature in CSS3 are filters, which basically allow you to apply some kind of filter, much like you would see in a photo editing program, to an element, generally an image element. And so I've inserted this image here, and I can set a filter using the filter property. And there's a number of different ones you can do. You can, a really common one to do is grayscale. So you can turn your image black and white. You can also turn it sepia tone. And you can do things like, you can apply a blur to your image. And this can be combined with transitions and hover effects. So if I want to unblur an image on hover, I can set the blur to 2 pixels on the image and then 0 on the hover, and then a transition to it. And you see that I unblur this image when I hover over it. You'll see similar things at times with grayscale. So you can see that I do a grayscale on hover to my particular image. CSS3 also introduced transforms, which allow you to change something about an item regarding its size, its rotation, and things like that. So you can skew, scale, rotate. Those are the most common transforms. So let's say I want to take my image, and on hover, I'm going to apply a transform of rotate 90 degrees. And you'll see that that takes my element and it rotates it on hover. So transform is a really useful thing. You can also do things like scaling it up or skewing the image in particular ways. We're going to conclude by looking at animations, which are a fairly complicated thing to do, one of the more complicated things you can do in CSS, but they're also incredibly powerful. So transitions happen once and only once, or they happen on a particular trigger, such as hover. Animations are something that you can do repeated times, and they allow you to move elements on the page in a very powerful fashion with a lot of different things that you can do with them. So The first thing you need to do is you need to specify how your animation is going to work. And so you're going to do that with the at keyframes rule. And that goes where your selector goes, much like the at font face or at media rules. So we're going to do at keyframes, and then we're going to call our animation something. In this case, I am going to call this example so that you can see it work with an example. I've created a blank empty div here, and I've also given it a width and height and a background color so that you can see it. So inside of the keyframes rule, this is where we're going to specify how the animation is going to occur. So we're going to do from, and we're also going to do to. And this is a simple two-step animation. And from is going to be your starting point. So let's say background color red, over to a different background color, say green. This will set your animation to occur, but then you also need to set your animation in the element you want to animate. So this is done either with the animation shorthand property, or I'm actually going to show it to you with individual properties here. So the first one is animation name, which in this case is example. There's also animation duration, and these are the two required ones. So we're going to do a 2-second animation. You see now that this particular element animates because we have the two required things here, name and duration. We can, however, set a number of other animation properties here. So animation iteration count will tell it how many times to animate this particular thing. And you see, so it's going to do 5 times. That's my 5th one. And then it's going to stop. So that animation will run through 5 different times. You can also set the animation to a delay so that it will not start until after your delay. So you see 2-second delay, and then the full loop of animations will occur. Perhaps the most useful thing then is that you can also set direction. So you can reverse the animation from green over to red, or you can set alternate, which will run it in forward direction and then reverse direction so that you see we transition smoothly from red to green, back to red, and so on. Let's look at this with another set of properties here. We are going to set a bounce on this particular one. So we're going to do keyframes of bounce, and we're going to call it bounce here. What we're going to do with this then is we are going to set a position relative on our div here, and we're going to tell it to bounce from top 0 to top 10 pixels. So you see that this will move our element here. However, we want it to bounce a little bit faster, so let's set a 500 millisecond bounce on this. And we're going to want this item to bounce, let's say, 10 times. So in this case, it would be 20 because it includes the alternate reverses. I'm also going to remove the delay. And so now you see this will bounce 10 times in this kind of fastish bounce here. And then it will stop. The final important thing to know with keyframes is that the from and to elements will allow you to do multiple steps in your animation. So I've done 2-step ones with from and to, but you can also set these via percentages. So we can set a 0%, and we can set a 25%, and we can set a 50%, and we can set 100% as well. So you see this still will do a little bit faster on one end because of where I've placed these. Let's take a look actually with going to 30 pixels and then like, let's say 100 pixels. And you see this will change the speed of my bounce into different locations based on where I've set my percentages. This is a really a powerful and useful thing to be able to set multiple stops so that you can have items move into different locations across different speeds and throughout an entire animation loop. As I said at the beginning of the video, these are fairly advanced styles, and as such, the vast majority of these styles will need to be prefixed with vendor prefixes. You should look them up using a site like Can I Use to find out which vendor prefixes are important to catch which browsers. That concludes this video as well as all of the Learn CSS videos. I hope you've learned a lot about how to do CSS styling and layout. Thanks for watching.